Good day, denizens. So we go into World War II, our second part here. The war on the home front, the American home front, that is, as every country, of course, had to experience the war on their own home front. But we use the U.S. as our example here. And you can see in the image women working in the factories. Once the war starts, many of the men going off to war, women come in to work in the factories, and women working in the factories is going to help them make, though they are brief, some key strides in women's rights. Those rights will actually, though, begin to diminish shortly after the war, but it does lay the foundation for women to call for more liberties as we move through really the late 50s and then especially with the 1960s and the major civil rights movement. Also, we'll talk about here American reactions, racist reactions to Japanese Americans. The United States is going to decide to intern or basically put into camps, internment camps as they will call them, Japanese Americans who are complete American citizens during this conflict. And we'll also talk about how the war itself pulls the U.S. out of the Great Depression and how the government uses all kinds of propaganda. Well, a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which called for the internment of Japanese Americans. And you can see the image here. You would have seen an image like this, especially in places like California, where many Japanese had settled over the course of really, I guess, decades, if not centuries, well, not centuries, many decades, and had established their family roots there. And we had people, the Nisei, as they were called, who were born in the United States, like Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA, but who are going to be considered threats to security. And the United States government fears that the Japanese Americans are plotting, that they're loyal to Japan instead of the United States, which never turns out to be the case. And one of the more frightening things about the internment of the Japanese during World War II is that the American press, even mediums like the New York Times, actually supported this internment of American citizens during the conflict. It was almost unanimous. So it's a little bit frightening that American citizens are being thrown into basically a jail for the most part. We'll see images and watch a little clippage on this to give you a better idea of what these camps were like, these internment camps. But nonetheless, that the press basically just supported this instead of challenging it, instead of questioning whether or not this was a violation of your First Amendment or, geez, any rights in the Constitution. It's amazing that the press just pretty much supported this. The Supreme Court, it didn't really intervene purposely. Now, there is going to be a major Supreme Court case, Korematsu v. United States, that is kind of forced upon the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, when people are being thrown into these camps, rounded up and put into these camps, the Supreme Court doesn't step up, voluntarily and say, hey, this might be a violation of their constitutional rights. Now, interestingly, in Hawaii, Hawaii basically becomes a police state during World War II. So basically it is under martial law. So therefore Japanese Americans in Hawaii, they were exempt. In other words, they weren't really part of the internment policy because basically the entire territory, remember Hawaii is not a state yet, the entire territory was basically under military rule. And basically, the Japanese were able to use this. Japan itself, who the U.S. is fighting at this point, they know what's going on. This is international news here, and they're able to use that to their own advantage. Say, look, see, America is racist. Of course, the Japanese believe that they're a superior race over in Asia as well. And finally, yeah, we do see there was one Supreme Court case that went up through the network of the circuit courts, where essentially the Supreme Court upheld the legality of Japanese internment. The Supreme Court said, yep, it is legal for American citizens to be put into these camps. And here you see a family that's getting ready to go away to Japanese internment camp. You can see how they would have labels on them, basically with number and their name, and they had to pack up, a suitcase or two and head off to these camps. And this image here was actually taken by a lady named Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange became a very prominent photographer during the Great Depression, working for the government. And then she continued on during World War II, taking images such as this one. And here you can see where the camps are located with the little squares there. And we'll check out a clip on Hart Mountain up there in far northern Wyoming, near the border of Montana. And we'll see, where, over 10,000 Japanese Americans are going to be put into this camp. As a matter of fact, the camp is so big it becomes, I think, the second or third largest, I think the third largest city in the state because of the internment of the Japanese. And like I said, the majority of the Japanese being interned are American citizens, born right here in the United States. World War II is also a propaganda war. And you see a lot of propaganda just like this. We'll talk about these a little bit, but basically, the United States government telling people on the home front, especially women, many of these geared toward women, that they are also part of this war. The U.S. government told women that they were also fighting for freedom by rationing things, by planting so-called victory gardens to preserve, food for the troops fighting overseas. But women are also, they're going to work in the factories. Women are going to fly aircraft. They're going to bring aircraft across the Atlantic to base them in Britain. Women play a monstrous role in this war. If women do not fulfill their role in this war, very likely the United States would not have been as successful as it was in this conflict, for sure. And one of the most prominent iconic images that comes out of this conflict, of course, is Rosie the Riveter. You can see there on the left, that's the more pop art culture image of Rosie the Riveter. That's not the actual original image of Rosie the Riveter. We'll see that in another slide. But you see over here on the right, women working in munitions industries. And it's interesting because for the longest time, women were told, well, no, you're not capable of this kind of work. You need to stay in the home. But all of a sudden, when they're needed, oh, yeah, I guess you can do that kind of work. So it kind of shows the hypocrisy of American society, really. And like I pointed out, World War II, women are told they're fighting for freedom, which they are, especially by advertisers and the government. And it does help them make some temporary gains in terms of their social and political cultural rights. Now there's the original Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter was painted by Norman Rockwell, who becomes a very famous painter for World War II imagery. We saw him previously in the previous PowerPoint where he depicted the four freedoms from FDR. So Norman Rockwell becomes very famous during this time with his paintings. And it's interesting to look at these two images here. The image on the left is an actual picture of a female lathe operator in Texas, and you can just tell by her look that she's exhausted, dirty, tired, working hard. Whereas you see an advertisement on the right in McCall's magazine, and this woman looks interested and happy and focused and wide awake. Because that's kind of the advertising side of it, as opposed to on the left where you see the reality of this hard work. And to kind of add insult to injury, even though women have this seeming independence during the war, you have posters like this one during World War II that still emphasize the male-dominated family. Look at this. It says, "This is America, where the family is a sacred institution, where children love, honor, and respect their parents, where a man's home is his castle. This is your America, keep it free." So a man's home is his castle. And of course, the women are running the castles and the economy and the war effort at home. But yet they're still trying to emphasize that men are still the man of the castle and have complete control. It's very much also a propaganda war in terms of film. Film had been around since the early 20th century, well, actually even earlier than that, very late 1890s. By this time, we have color film, um, at least cartoons anyway, and we have voicing, uh, where characters can talk, sound and film. And really, Walt Disney and Looney Tunes take off, and kids would be watching these cartoons, adults, whatever. I mean, even adults, I still like Looney Tunes. I mean, come on. But nonetheless, some very famous cartoons that came out, some very racist cartoons that came out, that were very anti-German, anti-Japanese. So these cartoons, not only were they used as propaganda tools, but they also show, the still racial values, or racist values that really dominated a lot of American society. And we'll check out one of these. We'll actually check out Donald Duck there in Der Fuhrer's face. Good stuff. So this guy, Asa Philip Randolph, A. Philip Randolph, he is this civil rights leader. Basically, in the decade or so before Martin Luther King comes about, in the 50s. And what A. Philip Randolph does is he's able to pressure the president, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, into signing another executive order, this one 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industry. In other words, this guy forced FDR to issue an executive order telling arms manufacturers, telling businesses that, hey, you cannot discriminate and only hire white folk, you have to hire African Americans as well. And FDR is basically forced to agree to this. So really for African Americans, this World War II itself is going to help begin the modern civil rights movement. And you can see here African Americans working in the factories, African American women working in the factories, and of course protesting for their rights as well. And overall, what we see is the development of something called the Double V campaign, double victory. Victory over racism at home, to defeat discrimination at home, and to fight fascism overseas. Because let's be realistic here, how can the United States say that it's fighting fascists, oppressive fascists overseas to create freedom, but yet still have Jim Crow and oppression and discrimination and segregation in the United States, right? So in World War II, we have this so-called Double V campaign calling for victory on both of those fronts. And just to give you an idea of some of the just absolute silliness in American society, Western European, Anglo-Saxon society, here's a poster from the Red Cross, and I'm sorry, from the NAACP. The Red Cross, what they had been doing was they actually segregated blood. There were vials of black blood and vials of white blood, which is just silly. And what this NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is trying to point out is that blood is blood. Now, there are different types of blood, but it doesn't have anything to do with color of skin. But sadly, the American military, the Army, will be segregated for the duration of the war. It will not be desegregated or integrated until after the war by Harry Truman in 1947. And here you can see the segregated Army, an all-white unit here, recruits, Marines here. And that's kind of what this poster is getting at, right? The evil Nazi, this is the enemy. But look in his monocle, he is seeing, a person being lynched. We assume, probably an African American being, attacked in the South. So basically this cartoon trying to point out that, the Nazis are ruthless and evil, but some of the actions by U.S. citizens aren't exactly great either. And here we see African Americans able to register to vote in Birmingham, Alabama. So, if African Americans are able to register to vote, first of all, it's showing major strides. And secondly, in the Deep South, in a place like Birmingham, Alabama, being able to register to vote shows that, freedom is beginning to increase, and that the civil rights movement is beginning to take hold in the United States during the war. So what about the home front? Well, once war begins, you can forget about the Great Depression. Unemployment basically goes away. The production of things back in the United States just soars. Income taxes also increase, right? You got to pay for wars. The West Coast, California especially, is going to witness the greatest growth during the war. People moving there, the armaments industries moving out there as well. And organized labor, as in like labor unions. They helped by agreeing not to strike. Now there will be some strikes during the war, but overall, overall labor is very agreeable in terms of understanding that, okay, it's the war effort. We need to put our differences aside and make sure that we can win this conflict. And the United States government creates an Office of War Information, and it's going to use all kinds of mediums, radio, film, the press, to give the ideological meaning to this conflict, right? To tell Americans this is about freedom. It's about defeating oppression and defeating the evils of fascism. But also back home, this is the first total war for the United States. World War I was a total war, but it wasn't for the U.S. World War II is a total war for the U.S., which means that everything, society, the economy, all businesses, the government, it's all geared toward winning the war. So basically what that means is Americans back home are going to experience rationing. Meaning basically that quotas were set up for how much access you had as a citizen to certain goods, especially things like gasoline, rubber, tires, even things like foodstuffs. All of these things were rationed, so you would actually get a booklet that had some stamps in it, and once you were out of stamps for that month, you could no longer purchase those particular things. And here you see great news for some guys who had experienced the Great Depression. A board listing jobs up in Detroit. You can see in July of '41, Great Depression is over, and all of a sudden businesses need workers. Workers. And here you see a Cadillac plant, but I don't see any Cadillacs. I see tanks. And that's what happens in a total war. If your factory makes cars, now they're making tanks. Your factory makes aluminum cans, now they're making bullets, right? All of these places, turnover production, total war, turnover production to making things for the war.